It had been almost a year since my mother and I last spoke when her name suddenly lit up on my phone screen. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the sound of the ringtone filling my apartment like an echo from another lifetime. I had worked hard to build a quiet, stable existence. Early mornings, spreadsheets, the same coffee shop each day, the kind of predictable rhythm that felt like safety. But the sound of her name still had power. It carried with it all the chaos I thought I had left behind. After I finally answered, her voice was bright, too bright, the kind of forced optimism that always preceded something unpleasant. She said she had incredible news and wanted to see me. She didn't ask how I'd been. She never did. When the call ended, I sat in silence for several minutes, the hum of the city outside my window fading into nothing. Part of me knew I should have said no, but the truth is, I wanted to believe that maybe she had changed. Hope is a dangerous thing when it's tied to someone who's hurt you. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed old memories like a broken film reel. The smell of cheap perfume, the piles of unopened bills on the kitchen counter, the way she used to promise that things were finally turning around. I remembered the constant moves, the forced smiles, the way I used to count coins from the couch cushions to help her buy gas. I learned early that love in our home came with invoices attached. By morning, I convinced myself that seeing her wasn't a mistake, just closure. I told myself I was strong now, different from the scared teenager who used to fix her credit card statements. But even as I got dressed for the meeting, I felt the old tension creep into my shoulders, the invisible armor I always wore around her. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw traces of her. The same eyes, the same cautious smile. And I wondered if blood ever truly stops binding you, even when love fails. The drive to the Harborview Hotel was quiet. The city was waking up, commuters rushing past, lives moving forward. I envied them, their simplicity. I parked across the street and watched the revolving glass doors swallow strangers whole. They walked in confident, unburdened, unaware of how lucky they were not to be meeting ghosts. I sat there longer than I intended, watching the clock tick toward noon, hoping the knot in my stomach would ease. It didn't. I knew, deep down, that my mother didn't want to see me just to reconnect. She never reached out without a reason. Still, I told myself I could handle whatever this was. I had faced harder things. I had survived her before. By the time I stepped out of the car, the autumn air felt sharper than usual, slicing through the illusion of calm I tried to wear like a second skin. My heels clicked against the marble floor of the hotel lobby as I walked toward the restaurant. Everything smelled expensive: coffee, perfume, polished wood. And I felt strangely out of place, like a visitor in a version of her world that only ever existed in her imagination. I checked my reflection in a mirrored column, adjusted my blazer, and exhaled. Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, I realized that this meeting wasn't about closure. It was about testing how much of my peace she could still take. What I didn't know then was that this would be the last time I'd ever see her as my mother. The version of her that existed before that day would soon be replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And the person I was when I walked into that hotel would never walk out again the same. If you're watching this, please hit the like button, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. When I think about my childhood, the memories come in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. I remember the peeling wallpaper in our rented house, the smell of burnt coffee that always lingered in the kitchen, and the sound of my mother's laughter echoing through rooms that were already half-packed for our next move. We were always preparing to start over. She used to call it chasing opportunity. I called it running from consequence. My mother, Evelyn, had an energy that filled any space she entered. She could convince anyone of anything, including herself. After my parents' divorce, she reinvented herself as a wellness coach, a title that sounded sophisticated until you realized it meant selling advice she didn't follow. Every week brought a new phase: meditation retreats, crystal healing, essential oils, manifestation seminars. Each venture was supposed to be the one that would finally change our lives. Each one ended the same way: unpaid bills, broken promises, and another cardboard box filled with our things. By the time I was 10, I understood more about financial survival than most adults. I knew how to read the red final notice stamps on envelopes, how to stall utility companies with polite excuses, and how to act calm when the landlord knocked too loudly. My mother always smiled through it. She said the universe rewarded optimism. I didn't believe in the universe back then. I believed in numbers. Numbers told the truth. Numbers didn't lie to you to keep hope alive. School was my escape. I liked the structure, the certainty, the rules that didn't change depending on someone's mood. I stayed late whenever I could, claiming to need library time, when really I just wanted to breathe in a space that didn't smell like stress. Teachers called me responsible. They didn't know responsibility was a survival mechanism. At 14, I got my first job bagging groceries at a corner store. My paychecks were small, but they gave me something I'd never had before: control. I used the money to buy food when our fridge was empty and paid the electric bill once when my mother forgot. She cried that day, saying she couldn't believe how grown up I was. I wanted to believe it was pride. Deep down, I knew it was relief. There were good moments too, brief flashes that made the bad ones easier to bear. The nights when she'd put on old records and dance barefoot in the living room, laughing like the world hadn't already decided who she was. The mornings when she'd braid my hair and promise that someday we'd have a house by the ocean. I held on to those moments tightly because they were rare and fleeting, and they made me feel like maybe she really could change. But even in those tender fragments, there was always a shadow. The phone calls from creditors she took in another room, the unopened envelopes stacked in drawers, the way her eyes glazed over when people talked about stability. She was allergic to permanence. I learned early that nothing in her life was meant to last. Not jobs, not homes, not relationships. And yet, no matter how many times the world knocked her down, she always found someone to believe in her again. When I turned 16, we moved to a smaller apartment after her mindfulness workshop business failed. I came home one afternoon to find the living room half empty. She had sold our furniture to pay off a debt she called temporary. We sat on the floor eating canned soup, pretending it was a picnic. I smiled because it made her feel better. I always smiled, even when my stomach twisted from fear. That was the year I realized my mother didn't need a partner to be codependent. She had me. I was her confidant, her accountant, her therapist, her scapegoat. Every time she made a mistake, she'd say it was because she was doing her best for me. Every time I questioned her choices, she reminded me how much she'd sacrificed. The word sacrifice began to sound like a curse, one that bound me to her guilt. When I graduated high school, I left for college with a scholarship and 2 suitcases. She cried at the bus station, telling me how proud she was. I wanted to believe it, but there was something in her eyes I recognized too well. Fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing control. Fear of who she'd be without me to fix things. As the bus pulled away, I promised myself that I would never become her. I would never live chasing apologies or debts. But the thing about growing up in chaos is that it teaches you to normalize instability. You learn to confuse intensity with love, crisis with connection, guilt with loyalty. It took me years to understand that I wasn't responsible for her choices, that being her daughter didn't mean being her rescuer. Still, that understanding didn't erase the conditioning. It lingered quietly, shaping every decision I made, who I trusted, what I feared, and how easily I mistook manipulation for affection. I thought leaving home meant escaping the pattern. But the truth is, patterns follow you until you decide to break them. Looking back now, I realize I never really escaped her orbit. I just moved far enough away to pretend I did. And when her name flashed on my phone that night, all it took was one ring to pull me right back into the gravity I had spent my whole life trying to outrun. Independence didn't come to me in a single moment. It was a slow construction, brick by brick, choice by choice, built out of exhaustion rather than ambition. When I left home for college, I didn't cry. I didn't even look back. I remember sitting on that bus, my knees pressed against the seat in front of me, watching my hometown disappear in the rearview mirror and feeling nothing but relief. For the first time, I didn't have to be the adult in someone else's life. I only had to be me. College was harder than I expected, but the difficulty felt clean. The struggles were measurable: exams, deadlines, grades. I could prepare for them, fix them, improve them. There were no surprise bills hidden under couch cushions, no sudden mood swings to decode, no false optimism I had to pretend to believe. I learned that peace isn't silence. It's the absence of fear. I majored in finance because it was the opposite of my upbringing. Numbers obeyed rules. They rewarded discipline. They didn't crumble under emotion or wishful thinking. My classmates talked about following passion, but I followed logic. I wanted stability more than joy. Joy was unpredictable. Stability meant safety. I worked constantly. I became the girl who always said yes to extra shifts, extra projects, anything that kept my schedule full and my mind quiet. I stacked part-time jobs like armor, mornings in the campus bookstore, evenings waitressing, weekends at a gas station. I rarely slept more than a few hours at a time, but I didn't care. The fatigue was proof that I was building something that belonged only to me. Even with scholarships, money was tight. I remember counting out quarters to buy groceries, eating instant noodles for weeks at a time. But even in those moments, I never felt poor. Poverty to me was the helplessness of my childhood, waiting for someone else's mistake to ruin everything again. This was different. This was control. I was tired, but the kind of tired that led somewhere. Occasionally, my mother would resurface. The calls were unpredictable, arriving like storms after long droughts. Sometimes she would sound affectionate, almost nostalgic, asking about my classes, pretending to care. Other times, the warmth dissolved into subtle guilt, reminders of everything she had done for me, framed as debts I could never repay. I learned to keep the conversations short, polite, and emotionally neutral. I wanted connection, but not at the cost of my peace. After graduation, I moved to Boston. The city felt alive in a way that demanded your full attention: fast, loud, expensive. I found a small apartment that barely fit a bed and a desk, but it was mine. I painted the walls pale gray and filled the space with silence. For the first time, I could leave my keys on the table without fear of eviction notices waiting underneath them. I got an entry-level position at a tech firm as a junior financial analyst. The hours were brutal and the competition fierce, but I didn't mind. I treated my career like a fortress. Every late night, every spreadsheet, every promotion was a layer of protection between me and the chaos I came from. I became reliable, the one people trusted to fix things. It felt good to be needed for competence instead of emotional labor. When my first real paycheck arrived, I cried. Not out of joy, but from a strange kind of grief. It felt like closing a chapter I never realized was still open. I took a small part of that money and bought a second-hand coat, warm, heavy, and far too expensive for my budget. It became a symbol of something deeper. I could take care of myself now. Over the next few years, I climbed slowly but steadily. Promotions came, raises followed, and with them, the illusion of distance. I built my life around numbers, deadlines, and predictability. I avoided relationships that felt too intense, too unpredictable. Emotional risk was something I no longer allowed myself. Love, I told myself, was a luxury people with stable childhoods could afford. My mother's messages became less frequent but never disappeared entirely. They always carried a familiar rhythm, a warm opening, a story of struggle, a soft request for help. I sent small amounts of money at first, telling myself it was the last time. Each time I did, the old guilt returned, wrapping around my ribs like a ribbon I couldn't cut. Despite everything, a part of me still wanted her approval. I wanted her to see me as successful, balanced, whole, everything she had never managed to be. I imagined that if I just achieved enough, maybe she'd finally be proud of me, not because of what I could give her, but because of who I had become. That illusion stayed with me far longer than I care to admit. Years passed. My savings grew. I bought a modest 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood. It was small, but sunlight poured through the windows every morning, and the sound of the city faded to a distant hum at night. When I signed the mortgage papers, I felt a weight lift off my chest. This wasn't just a purchase, it was proof that I had broken the cycle. But freedom built on avoidance is fragile. Beneath the calm surface of my life, there was still a quiet fear that everything could collapse again. Not because of me, but because of her. Every unknown number on my phone made my stomach tighten. Every unexpected email made my pulse quicken. I told myself I was safe now, untouchable. I believed that until the night her name lit up my phone again. In that single moment, years of distance evaporated, and I realized that no matter how far you run, your past will always know your number. The morning of the lunch felt heavier than it should have. I woke before sunrise, restless, my body already aware of something my mind refused to name. The city outside my window was quiet, the kind of calm that comes just before a storm. I moved through my apartment in silence, making coffee I barely drank and checking the time more often than necessary. Every part of me wanted to cancel, to send a polite message saying something had come up. But guilt has its own gravity, and mine still pulled me toward her. I left early, pretending I was being practical about parking, though I knew I just didn't trust myself not to back out at the last minute. The drive to Harborview was smooth, the kind of empty road commute that leaves you alone with your thoughts. With every mile, I replayed old memories. The last time we had lunch together, the promises she had made, the way I'd left feeling both hopeful and hollow. She had always known how to make me feel responsible for her happiness, as if loving her meant financing her mistakes. When I arrived, the hotel looked exactly as I remembered, elegant, polished, untouchably clean. It was the kind of place she loved, full of people who looked successful, full of mirrors where she could rehearse the version of herself she wanted others to see. I stood outside for a long moment, pretending to check messages, giving myself one last chance to turn around. But I didn't. I straightened my jacket, lifted my chin, and walked in. The hostess led me to a table by the window. The room smelled of perfume and money. Conversations floated around me like soft background music. Business meetings, anniversaries, lives that seemed simpler than mine. I ordered water and pretended to study the menu while keeping an eye on the entrance. When she finally appeared, it was as if the air shifted. She looked radiant in a way that didn't feel real. Her hair perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, her clothes expensive enough to make me question where they had come from. She moved with confidence, the kind she used to fake before a big pitch or a new venture. I recognized the performance instantly. The smile that didn't reach her eyes, the way she greeted the waiter with just enough charm to seem important. Watching her approach was like watching a magician prepare a trick I already knew the ending to. And yet, beneath the skepticism, a small, naive part of me still hoped she was genuinely happy, that maybe her life had finally stabilized. We made small talk at first. She asked about my job, my apartment, my health. All the safe topics that sound like care but feel like reconnaissance. I answered carefully, avoiding numbers, keeping details vague. She laughed often, a little too loudly, as if to prove she was thriving. I studied her hands while she talked, manicured nails, a gold bracelet that looked new. She always wore symbols of success even when everything underneath was falling apart. As the waiter cleared the first course, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek folder. My stomach tightened before she even opened it. She placed it on the table, almost lovingly, aligning it perfectly with the edge of her plate. I already knew it wasn't a photo album or a birthday card. Inside were papers, neatly clipped, marked with highlights, the kind of precision only desperation creates. The words on the pages were a familiar language to me. Loan applications, high interest rates, signatures missing from certain lines. At the bottom of each page was my name, pre-filled in the section labeled co-signer. The numbers leapt out at me, $180,000, repeated across multiple documents. The description: Wellness Retreat Center, expansion funding. My pulse quickened, a dull roar filling my ears. She was asking me to back her next dream, to risk everything I had worked for on a business that existed only in her imagination. I stared out the window for a long moment, trying to absorb the skyline. The harbor glimmered under the noon sun, beautiful and indifferent. I thought about the version of myself I had built: disciplined, careful, logical. I had spent my entire adulthood creating distance between her chaos and my stability, only to find myself here again, one decision away from losing everything. Her voice softened as she explained the opportunity, how it was almost done, how she just needed one small act of support. Her tone was rehearsed, her words carefully chosen to sound inevitable. I realized then that this lunch wasn't a request, it was an ambush. She had already decided I would say yes, because I always had. The weight of the folder on the table felt like a test, and for a moment I hated how well she still knew me. She knew the guilt I carried, the longing for her approval, the reflex to fix things. She knew I would sit there quietly, letting her story unfold while I calculated every possible way to save her without losing myself. But something in me was shifting, subtle and new. Maybe it was age, maybe exhaustion, maybe it was the years of therapy disguised as workaholism. Whatever it was, it made me see her differently. Her confidence looked fragile now, her charm desperate. For the first time, I saw not the mother who needed rescuing, but the woman who had built her entire survival on my compliance. By the time the check arrived, my appetite was gone. I left the folder on the table, unopened now, the numbers still echoing in my mind. As I walked out of the restaurant, the bright autumn sun hit my face, sharp and blinding. Behind me, I could still feel her presence like static electricity, invisible, but ready to shock if I ever reached back. That day, I didn't realize what I had just escaped. I only knew that the version of her I had hoped to find was gone, replaced by someone who saw my success not as pride, but as profit. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt something colder. The first tremor of a fracture that would soon split my entire life in two. I didn't sleep the night after the Harborview lunch. The image of that folder kept flashing behind my eyes. The numbers, the neat signature line waiting for my name, the quiet certainty in her voice when she said it was just a formality. I had replayed the moment 100 times, trying to find a version of it that felt like love, but all I saw was calculation. Every success I had worked for, every hour of overtime, every penny I'd saved, all of it had become something she thought she was entitled to. By morning, I decided to meet her again, if only to make things clear. I told myself I wanted closure, but deep down, I think I wanted proof. Proof that she could still choose me over her ambition. That she could still be a mother instead of a strategist. Hope is cruel that way. It lingers even after trust is gone. The next day was gray, the kind of sky that looks like it could collapse. I arrived early again, not because I was eager, but because anxiety always made me punctual. The restaurant was quieter than before, the clatter of dishes echoing through the open space. I chose a seat by the window, facing the harbor, and tried to steady my breathing. My reflection in the glass looked older somehow, more tired than I remembered. When she arrived, She carried the same polished energy as before, expensive perfume, flawless hair, a smile that didn't match the exhaustion behind her eyes. She ordered tea while I asked for water, already aware that nothing about this meeting would go smoothly. I watched the steam rise from her cup, curling upward like smoke, delicate and dangerous. She began with pleasantries, small talk that dissolved into subtle guilt. I knew the rhythm too well. The compliments, the reminders of sacrifice, the nostalgic stories about the past. Each word was another thread of manipulation, woven carefully into something that looked like love but felt like debt. I listened quietly, not because I wanted to, but because silence was the only armor I had left. Then her tone changed. She spoke of timing, opportunity, and how this was her last chance to finally succeed. She mentioned my stability as if it were an extra resource the universe had given her through me. It was as though my achievements existed not as my own, but as proof that she had done something right. I felt my throat tighten as she circled back to the loan. The same figure, the same phrases about trust and family, the same insistence that it was for us. When I refused, the light in her eyes shifted. Something cold flickered beneath the surface, a flash of anger she tried to disguise with a smile. She adjusted her napkin, pretended to sip her tea, and began to talk faster, her voice rising, her words sharper. The performance was unraveling. I could see the panic behind her composure, the desperation she had worked so hard to mask. For years, I had believed that if I just explained myself calmly, she would understand. But that day, as she leaned forward, her voice dripping with disappointment and accusation, I realized she didn't want understanding. She wanted submission. My refusal wasn't rejection. It was rebellion, and rebellion was something she couldn't forgive. The moment stretched thin between us. Her hands trembled slightly, the spoon clinking against the porcelain as she stirred. The air felt heavy, charged with something unsaid. And then, without warning, the cup tipped. The tea hit me before I even registered what had happened. Scalding, immediate, searing across my wrist and spilling down my arm. The shock was pure silence. I froze, staring at the spreading stain on my sleeve, the steam rising from the tablecloth. Pain came a second later, sharp and electric, radiating through my skin. She gasped, but it was the kind of sound that belonged to someone witnessing an inconvenience, not a consequence. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. Every eye in the room turned toward us, conversations halting mid-sentence. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the burn throbbing with every beat. My mother's face was pale now, her lips parted, her eyes darting toward the exit. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might apologize, that some maternal instinct might surface after all. But she didn't move. She just stared, as if this too were something that could be ignored, rewritten, repackaged into another story where she was the victim. I left before the pain became unbearable. I walked past the staff, past the stairs, out into the cold wind that bit against my burned skin. The world outside kept moving, cars, voices, the hum of ordinary life. But mine had shifted on its axis. Somewhere between the scalding tea and her silence, something inside me broke free. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sadness. It was the quiet realization that I had finally reached the end of trying. There would be no more explanations, no more forgiveness, no more negotiations disguised as love. I had spent my whole life being the adult she refused to be. Now, I was done. As I drove home with my wrist wrapped in napkins, the burn throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. It hurt, but it was a clean kind of pain. The kind that comes when something poisonous finally leaves your body. That night, I sat by my window with my arm under cool water, watching the city lights shimmer on the glass. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. The worst had already happened. My mother had shown me exactly who she was, and I finally believed her. When I got home, The adrenaline that had carried me through the chaos began to fade, leaving behind a dull, pulsing ache that felt deeper than skin. My wrist was blistered and red, the pain steady and rhythmic, but what hurt more was the silence that followed. The apartment felt foreign that night, too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was waiting for me to fall apart. I ran cool water over the burn until my fingers went numb, but no amount of relief reached the part of me that had been scorched inside. I moved mechanically, changing clothes, wrapping my arm in a clean towel, pacing the living room like a ghost. The images replayed over and over, the tea, the heat, the way she looked at me afterward. It wasn't shock or regret on her face. It was something emptier, colder, a look that said I had finally stopped being useful. The realization landed with the weight of something irreversible. Eventually, I sat on the floor beside my bed, my body exhausted, but my mind still sprinting. Every cell in me wanted to rationalize what had happened, to find an explanation that would make it smaller, more bearable. But deep down, I knew this wasn't an accident. It was a physical manifestation of years of manipulation boiling over. That cup hadn't just spilled. It had broken the illusion that she loved me in any way that was safe. I should have gone to the hospital, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The outside world felt too bright, too real. Instead, I opened my laptop, hoping distraction might dull the pain. I went to check my work email, then my bank account. Simple routines, ordinary things. But what I found there stopped me cold. There were alerts I didn't recognize. New credit inquiries, unusual activity, a pending loan application under my name. At first I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch. Then I saw the address listed on the application, an old one my mother had used years ago. The burn on my wrist throbbed as I clicked through the documents, each one revealing something worse. She hadn't just asked me to co-sign that loan. She had already started the process. My name, my information, my credit history, all attached to a mountain of debt tied to her failing business. The same business she'd tried to convince me to invest in. My body went cold even as the pain stayed hot. I scrolled through the rest of my accounts, every click tightening the knot in my stomach. There were small charges I didn't recognize, accounts linked to my email that I had never created. She had crossed another line, one I hadn't even realized existed until it was already too late. The truth was stark and undeniable. She wasn't just desperate. She was dangerous. I spent the next hours documenting everything. Screenshots, statements, timestamps. The motions felt detached, like I was preparing evidence for someone else's life. Each new discovery made the burn on my wrist feel sharper, as if my body understood what my mind was still processing. The person who had hurt me wasn't just my mother. She was my betrayer. By the time dawn began to seep through the blinds, the city outside was stirring again. I hadn't slept, but something inside me had hardened into focus. I made a list of what needed to be done. Contact the bank, freeze the accounts, report the fraud. The list was long, methodical, and impersonal, a kind of armor made out of bullet points. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt angry, but it was a clean, directed anger. Still, beneath the structure of it all, there was grief. Not for the money or the stolen identity, but for the final confirmation that the mother I had been trying to save no longer existed. Maybe she never had. I had been loving a version of her I created out of fragments. The soft moments, the fleeting tenderness, the way she used to hum while cooking. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who saw me only as an extension of her survival. When the phone rang later that morning, I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, not yet. The thought of her tone, the false sweetness, the excuses, the justifications, made my stomach twist. I turned my phone face down and sat by the window, watching the light move slowly across the floor. The world looked the same as it had the day before, but nothing in me was untouched. As the day wore on, the burn began to stiffen, the skin tight and raw. Every movement sent a wave of pain up my arm. I didn't cover it anymore. I let it breathe. It felt symbolic somehow, a mark of truth that couldn't be hidden. It reminded me of what denial had cost me and what clarity had given me. That night, I sat at my desk with a notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. She can't touch me anymore. I stared at the words until they blurred, letting their meaning sink in. It wasn't entirely true. She had already left her mark. But it was a start. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass, distant and indifferent. Somewhere, my mother was probably already rewriting the story, turning herself into the victim she always needed to be. But this time, I wasn't part of her version. This time, I had my own story to tell. One that began, painfully but clearly, the moment the tea spilled. The morning after I discovered the fraud, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the list I had written the night before. The words were neat and controlled. Call the bank, file the report, contact the credit bureau. As if order could fix what had been broken. My arm was still bandaged, the skin beneath tender and pink. It throbbed each time my pulse quickened. A steady reminder that some damage couldn't be undone. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. I started with the banks. One by one, I called the numbers, explained the situation, provided identification. Each representative spoke with rehearsed sympathy, the kind used for strangers in distress. They called it identity theft, but to me it was more intimate than that. It wasn't just my identity she had stolen. It was the story of my life. My credit score, my reputation, my trust, all repurposed for her next illusion of success. Filing the police report was harder. The officer on duty asked for details, and as I recounted the events, the loan documents, the fake signatures, the spilled tea, I felt the weight of each word land in my chest. Saying it aloud made it real. The officer nodded quietly, taking notes, then handed me a case number. Just another file in a system built for people like me. The ones who never imagined they'd have to protect themselves from family. When I left the station, the sunlight felt too bright, almost intrusive. I walked for blocks without purpose, my thoughts buzzing like static. Each step carried an unfamiliar mixture of shame and relief. Shame for letting it go this far. Relief that I had finally drawn a line. There was no undoing what she had done, but I could still reclaim what was mine. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of paperwork and phone calls. I spent hours on hold, reciting the same explanations to different voices. I froze accounts, disputed charges, and changed passwords until I could barely remember any of them. It was exhausting, but strangely empowering. Every action, no matter how small, was a declaration. You don't own me anymore. At night, when the noise of the world quieted, the emotional weight returned. I would sit on the floor beside my bed, the city lights flickering through the curtains, and let the grief wash over me. Grief for the mother I had wanted, the one I kept trying to find inside a woman who didn't exist. I had spent my entire life believing that love meant endurance, that if I just held on long enough, she would finally see me as something more than a resource. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She never would. When the police followed up a week later, they told me the fraud was extensive. Multiple loans, fake investment accounts, clients she had defrauded through her wellness business. My name was only one among many. They said it was likely she'd be arrested soon. Hearing that should have brought satisfaction, but it didn't. It felt hollow, justice wrapped in sadness. I didn't want her punished. I just wanted her gone from the parts of my life she kept contaminating. Friends from work noticed my exhaustion, but I gave vague answers. I told them I was dealing with family issues, the kind of phrase people nod at without asking for details. It was easier than explaining that my mother had turned into a stranger wearing my face. Still, Their concern grounded me. They invited me to lunch, checked in through messages, reminded me that not all relationships were transactional. Their kindness, quiet and consistent, started to rebuild something in me I thought I had lost: the ability to trust. 2 weeks after filing the report, I received confirmation that the fraudulent accounts had been frozen. My credit was still damaged, but the bleeding had stopped. The investigator assigned to my case mentioned that the evidence against my mother was overwhelming. I thanked him, though the words felt strange in my mouth. Gratitude and grief don't fit neatly together. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and unwrapped the bandage from my wrist. The burn had begun to heal, leaving behind a pale, uneven scar. I traced it with my fingertips, surprised by how small it looked. For days, I had imagined it as something monstrous, a visible wound marking the end of everything. But now, it was just a line, faint and real. It no longer looked like a punishment. It looked like proof. I realized then that I had spent most of my life covering invisible burns, the kind that come from guilt and silence. This one, at least, I could see. It reminded me that survival sometimes looks like damage, that strength often begins in pain. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook again. The first page still read, "She can't touch me anymore." Beneath it, I added another line: "But I can choose what her touch left behind." I didn't know yet what that meant, not fully, but it felt true. Taking back my name wasn't just about reversing what she'd done. It was about reclaiming my sense of self, piece by piece, from the ashes of everything she'd tried to own. The process was slow, imperfect, and often lonely. But it was mine. For the first time, I wasn't living as her daughter or her savior. I was simply living as myself. The news broke 2 weeks later. It came quietly, the way devastation often does, not as a phone call or a warning, but as a headline. I was sitting at my desk in the office, halfway through my second coffee, when the alert appeared on my screen. My mother's name was there, bold and unforgiving, beneath the words, "Wellness coach accused of defrauding investors, daughter among victims." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The letters seemed to blur and rearrange themselves, as if my brain was trying to protect me from reading them. But there was no misinterpretation. There she was, her mugshot centered between paragraphs about fraudulent business practices, identity theft, and ongoing investigation. The photo didn't look like her, not exactly. The lighting was harsh, flattening the charisma she had always weaponized. Her expression wasn't angry or remorseful. It was vacant. People at work began to notice. Someone whispered near the printer. Another colleague glanced at me with that mix of curiosity and discomfort reserved for someone who's suddenly been made part of a spectacle. I excused myself, walked to the restroom, and stared at my reflection under fluorescent lights that seemed too bright. The woman looking back at me didn't seem shocked, just tired. Maybe deep down I had known this was coming. When I returned home, the story had spread. It was everywhere, reposted on social media, rephrased by local news outlets, dissected in online comment sections filled with strangers who treated my life like gossip. My phone vibrated nonstop. Messages from relatives, old classmates, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some wanted details. Some wanted to express pity. Others wanted to remind me that family is family, a phrase that had long stopped meaning anything to me. That night, I turned off my phone and sat in the dark. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pulsed with questions I didn't want to answer. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I thought I would be relieved when she was finally exposed, when the world could see what I had lived through. But instead, I felt hollow. Watching her fall didn't erase the years she had taken from me. It didn't undo the burn on my wrist or the panic I still felt every time an unknown number appeared on my phone. Justice, I was realizing, rarely feels like healing. Over the next few days, I avoided the outside world. I called in sick, left my blinds half closed, and let the hours stretch thin. When I finally ventured out for groceries, a woman at the checkout counter recognized me from the article. Her sympathetic smile made my stomach twist. I realized that my mother's downfall had turned me into collateral damage. Her name would always be attached to mine in ways I couldn't control. I tried to tell myself that this exposure was a kind of freedom, that the truth being public meant I no longer had to explain it. But freedom built on humiliation isn't freedom at all. It's just visibility without consent. Every time I thought about the story being out there, I felt stripped of something private and raw, the right to process my pain quietly. The police called again for follow-up statements. They had found more victims, clients who had lost savings, investors who believed in her promises, people who had trusted her the same way I once had. Hearing their stories made me feel both less alone and more burdened. I wasn't the only one she had deceived, but I was the one she had created. My guilt grew heavier with each revelation. When the court date was announced, reporters began calling. They left voicemails asking for comments, wanting to know how it felt to be betrayed by my own mother. I deleted them all. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been stolen and reshaped by strangers. The truth was too personal for headlines. One morning, my mailbox was full of letters from extended family, the kind of relatives who had barely been present in my life, but suddenly felt entitled to an opinion. They called her troubled, misunderstood, a victim of circumstance. Some accused me of being cold, of turning on my own blood. I read them all once, then tore them into small pieces and dropped them into the trash. It wasn't anger that made me do it, just finality. I was done justifying survival. In the quiet that followed, I began to notice how my body carried the trauma even when my mind tried to move past it. My shoulders stayed tense, my breath shallow. I woke from dreams where I was drowning, always with that same burning sensation crawling up my arm. I began therapy again, this time with someone who specialized in family trauma. For weeks, I spoke in circles, describing patterns, revisiting memories, trying to find a point where everything had started to go wrong. But the truth was, there was no single moment. It had been a slow erosion, a lifetime of small betrayals wearing down what love had once been. Therapy didn't give me closure, but it gave me vocabulary. Words like gaslighting, boundary violation, emotional enmeshment. Each term was like a light flicking on in a dark room. It helped me understand that my story wasn't a collection of isolated incidents, but a structure built on manipulation. And knowing that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape, and shape is easier to carry than chaos. Slowly, I started piecing together a new routine. I returned to work, avoided the gossip, and learned how to exist without explaining myself. The scar on my wrist had faded into a pale line, almost invisible now. But I saw it every time I reached for something. It wasn't a reminder of pain anymore. It was a warning of what happens when silence becomes habit. Months passed, and the story disappeared from the news cycle, replaced by fresher scandals. People forgot, as they always do. But I didn't. I couldn't. I carried her legacy in ways invisible to everyone but me. The wariness in my tone when people got too close, the instinct to flinch when someone praised me too loudly, the reflex to question every kind word. Yet somewhere inside all that caution, something else began to grow. A small, stubborn seed of self-trust. I had survived her deception, her rage, and the public shame that followed. I was still standing, and maybe that was enough for now. I didn't know what forgiveness looked like yet. Maybe it wasn't possible, not in the way people expected. But I did know this. Her downfall had freed me from the illusion that I could ever save her. The story the world saw was about a criminal case, a woman exposed. But the real story, my story, was about learning that survival sometimes means letting someone else fall, even when they share your face, your blood, your name. The months that followed my mother's arrest felt like living inside a quiet aftermath. The chaos had passed, but its echo lingered in every part of my life. I woke each morning to the hum of the city outside my window. Cars, footsteps, fragments of normalcy, and yet everything inside me felt slow, like a clock that had been reset but not wound again. For a while, I measured my healing in tasks. I made lists, bills to pay, accounts to update, emails to send. Numbers steadied me the way they always had. They were clean, neutral, predictable, a language my mother could never corrupt. In spreadsheets, there was no manipulation, no guilt, just logic. If the numbers balanced, I could almost believe I did too. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into long hours at the firm, auditing budgets, managing portfolios, tracking every decimal with obsessive precision. My colleagues saw it as dedication. I knew it was survival. Each balanced ledger, each finished report, felt like reclaiming a piece of control. But underneath the neat rows of data, a quiet emptiness spread. I was living efficiently, but not fully. At night, I often sat at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd once filed police reports and tried to make sense of what came next. My mother's trial was scheduled for early spring. The prosecutor called occasionally to update me. The evidence was solid, the case moving forward. I listened, nodded, and thanked them. But the words barely registered. Justice was happening in real time, yet I felt detached from it, as if it were a story about someone else. Therapy helped me start untangling that detachment. My therapist, a calm woman with a soft voice and steady eyes, never rushed me. She helped me name the patterns, the guilt reflex, the compulsive need to fix, the belief that boundaries were cruelty. She explained that trauma doesn't end when the person who caused it disappears. It lingers until you learn how to stop reenacting it. That idea terrified me. I had built my entire identity around preventing chaos, and now I had to confront the possibility that the chaos lived inside me too. She encouraged me to join a support group for adult children of emotionally manipulative parents. I resisted at first. I didn't want to sit in a circle and listen to strangers recount their pain. But after weeks of restless nights and endless overthinking, I went. The first meeting was in a church basement with flickering fluorescent lights. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety. When it was my turn to speak, my voice shook. I kept it brief, said that my mother had defrauded people, that she'd stolen my identity, that I didn't know how to stop feeling responsible for her choices. No one interrupted. No one tried to fix it. They just listened, nodding slowly, as if my words were familiar. As the weeks passed, I started to recognize pieces of myself in the stories others told. A woman described how her father used guilt like a leash, keeping her tethered with reminders of everything he'd done for her. A man admitted he couldn't make major life decisions without hearing his mother's imagined disapproval in his head. Their pain mirrored mine, their survival reflected my own. In that space, my experience stopped feeling like a secret. The group became a small anchor in the vastness of recovery. We met every Wednesday evening. Sometimes we laughed, other times we cried in silence, the air thick with understanding. There was no judgment in that room, just the unspoken truth that love can wound as deeply as it heals. I left each meeting lighter, though never entirely free. Healing wasn't linear, it was circular, looping back to old memories that demanded to be re-examined before they could finally dissolve. Outside of those walls, life slowly began to rebuild itself. My promotion came through, a new title, a raise, more responsibility. My boss congratulated me, unaware that behind my composed smile, I was still learning how to celebrate without guilt. The scar on my wrist had faded, but I caught myself touching it during stressful days, tracing the faint line as a reminder of where survival began. Eventually, I started volunteering with a nonprofit that offered financial literacy workshops for women leaving abusive relationships. Teaching them how to budget, open accounts, and understand credit gave my pain a kind of purpose. The first time I stood in front of a classroom of women and shared the basics of reclaiming financial control, my hands trembled. But as I spoke, I realized I wasn't teaching numbers. I was teaching freedom, the same kind I had clawed my way toward. There were setbacks, of course. The nights when I missed her voice even though I knew it was dangerous to remember it fondly. The holidays when loneliness crept in like a cold draft through a cracked window. The guilt that whispered that maybe I had overreacted, that maybe she had been sick rather than cruel. But therapy had taught me to recognize that whisper for what it was: conditioning. The residue of years spent believing I was responsible for her happiness. When the trial finally began, I didn't attend the hearings. I couldn't bear to see her sitting in a courtroom, her charm turned off, her face stripped of pretense. The prosecutor sent me updates. The plea deal was accepted. A reduced sentence in exchange for restitution to victims and mandatory therapy. It wasn't justice in the cinematic sense, but it was something. I realized then that justice isn't about punishment, it's about boundaries being restored. On the day her sentence was announced, I went for a walk by the harbor. The same harbor I had looked out over during that fateful lunch. The wind was sharp, the air salty, and the water glittered beneath a pale winter sun. I stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the cold sting my lungs. It felt like cleansing. Not forgiveness, but release. That evening, I opened my journal for the first time in months. I wrote without editing, without trying to make sense of the sentences. I wrote about the tea, the betrayal, the paperwork, the silence. Then, on a new page, I wrote a single sentence. Healing is not fixing what was broken. It's building something new where the ruins used to be. I looked around my apartment, small, quiet, and entirely my own. The plants on the windowsill leaned toward the light. The faint hum of the city filtered through the glass. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to brace for something bad. The fear that had lived in my body had grown softer, less sharp. My life wasn't perfect, and it wasn't painless, but it was mine. Every choice, every scar, every quiet morning, all mine. I realized then that healing wasn't a single act. It was a series of small, deliberate decisions to stop bleeding for people who refused to stop wounding you. It was choosing yourself, over and over again, until the choice no longer felt like rebellion, but peace. A full year passed before I realized I hadn't thought about her for an entire week. It happened quietly, without ceremony. One morning I woke, made coffee, opened my blinds, and it struck me that her name hadn't echoed in my thoughts for days. The absence felt strange at first, like noticing a noise that had finally stopped. Not silence exactly, but the return of stillness. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the city waking up, the light spilling between buildings, and realized that this was what peace looked like. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary morning free from the weight of fear. My mother's story had faded from the public eye. The news had moved on, new scandals replacing old ones, and her name was buried under layers of forgotten headlines. She was serving her sentence quietly, her restitution payments arriving in slow, bureaucratic increments that barely made a dent in what she had taken. I received periodic updates from the Victims' Assistance Office, but I rarely read them. The legal chapter was closed. What remained was something more complicated, the slow unraveling of a lifetime built around her shadow. I used to think healing would feel like light, sudden and pure. But it wasn't like that. It was work. It was waking up every day and choosing not to return to old versions of myself, the ones that sought her approval or carried her shame. It was small things. Deleting the voicemail she had left before her arrest, unsubscribing from news alerts that mentioned her name, learning how to answer the question, "Do you have family?" without flinching. Therapy helped me learn that grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from release, from letting go of something that was never good for you but had defined you for so long that you don't know who you are without it. I had spent most of my adult life as the daughter of someone I was always trying to save. When that role finally ended, there was space where guilt used to live. It took time to learn how to fill it with something else. I filled it with connection, real connection, the kind that didn't demand my exhaustion in exchange for affection. I stayed close with my support group, the circle of people who had become a kind of chosen family. We met every Wednesday still. Some weeks to talk, some just to exist together in a room where we didn't have to perform strength. There was comfort in their presence, in the quiet nods of understanding that said, "You're safe here." I built new routines around gentleness instead of survival. Weekend mornings spent wandering the farmer's market, evenings reading on the balcony, long walks by the water when I needed to remind myself that movement was still possible after years of standing guard. I started keeping a gratitude journal, not the performative kind filled with platitudes, but one that grounded me in small truths. A good meal, a song that made me breathe easier, the way the sun hit the scar on my wrist, turning it into something almost beautiful. The scar had faded to a faint line by then, a soft reminder rather than a wound. Sometimes I caught myself tracing it absent-mindedly during meetings or while cooking. It no longer carried the burn of pain, only memory. It was proof that I had survived something that once felt impossible. And more than that, it was proof that survival can coexist with softness. The nonprofit I volunteered for grew into something larger than I'd imagined. I began leading regular workshops, not just about budgeting and credit, but about financial autonomy and self-worth. I met women who had lost everything to partners, parents, siblings, employers, people they trusted. Each story was a different version of the same truth, that control disguised as love is still control. When I looked at them, I saw pieces of myself, the fear, the shame, the quiet defiance hiding underneath. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, I walked home under the city lights, feeling the familiar ache of empathy, that mixture of sorrow and pride for all the women who were fighting their way back to themselves. I realized then that helping others heal had become my way of finishing my own healing. Not by forgetting what happened, but by transforming it into something that no longer hurt to touch. As spring approached, I received another letter from the correctional facility. It was from my mother. I recognized her handwriting immediately, still elegant, still deliberate, still pretending control. I didn't open it right away. For days, it sat on my desk like an accusation. I told myself it didn't matter what it said, that I didn't need her words to validate my progress. And yet, some part of me, the small, human part that still wanted closure, hesitated to throw it away. When I finally opened it, the pages were filled with the same familiar cadence, regret dressed as justification, sorrow tangled with excuses. She wrote about therapy, about growth, about how she had finally seen the truth. But the truth she described wasn't mine. It was a softer version, one where her actions were mistakes rather than choices. I read to the end, not out of forgiveness, but out of curiosity. And when I was done, I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it in a drawer. I didn't need to respond. Silence, I had learned, was its own kind of boundary. After that, something in me settled. I no longer felt the urge to prove anything, not to her, not to the world, not even to myself. I had spent years surviving, then years recovering. Now I was simply living, and there was an unexpected beauty in that simplicity. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. The first brushstrokes were hesitant, almost clumsy, but soon color began to return to my life, literally and figuratively. My walls filled with soft blues, muted golds, and shades of gray that reminded me of fog over the harbor. Each canvas was a quiet declaration. I am still here. By the time the second anniversary of the incident arrived, I marked the day not with mourning but with stillness. I took the afternoon off work, drove to the lake my mother used to take me to when I was small, and sat on the same wooden dock, legs dangling over the water. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the scared daughter who once tried to earn love through sacrifice. It was a woman who had learned to stand in her own story without apology. The air was cool, the water calm. I watched a family nearby laughing as they fed ducks, the sound carrying softly across the surface. For the first time, I didn't feel envy watching other people's uncomplicated love. I felt gratitude that mine had come in a different form. Hard-won, imperfect, but real. As the sun began to lower, I thought about everything that had led me there: the spilled tea, the burns, the debt, the headlines, the therapy, the long nights spent stitching myself back together. Every piece of it had shaped me, but none of it defined me anymore. Pain had been the price of freedom, but freedom had been worth every scar. When I drove home, I didn't look back at the lake. Some chapters don't need to be revisited. They just need to be closed with grace. That night, as I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, the quiet felt different. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that settles into your bones when you've finally stopped running from yourself. And in that silence, I understood the final truth of my story. Freedom isn't loud, and healing isn't perfect. Sometimes it's just a quiet morning, a scar that doesn't ache, and the steady knowing that you are finally, irrevocably, your own.